Good morning, everyone. Thank you guys so much for being here for our second live in-person author interview, where today we talk to author Megan Haskell. Megan is an author that specializes in creating epic fantasies that involve wars, magical creatures, and heroes of diverse backgrounds and specialties. Today, we're here to talk about her novel, Fortune Shadows, which, if you are interested in getting a copy after this interview, you're more than welcome to right over there. Before we start, I do want to give a shout out to some people. I want to first say thank you to Megan for not only letting us collaborate with her for the month of January, but also helping us get this opportunity to be here at Blue Hummingbird Coffee. I want to give a huge thank you to Blue Hummingbird again for letting us host an interview at their location. So hopefully we can pay them back by grabbing a coffee on the way out when we're all done today. I want to give thanks to Elias and Lance for not only manning the cameras that allow us to capture this moment, but also giving us the support that we need behind the scenes so we can share this with fans that weren't able to make it today. And finally, I want to thank you all for being here today. You have no idea how much this type of support means to all of us here at BookBase, so thank you very much. With all that being said, let's get started. So Megan, my first question is, how are you feeling today?
It's Sunday, so, tea time of the soul, right? No, it's good. I'm really glad to be here. I'm so thrilled to be working with you guys. We had our interview last fall, which went so well and was so much fun, and I'm always happy to come out and be part of the community and meet readers, so I'm really excited to be here.
I love to hear it. And I think today we definitely have a really big turnout. Again, thank you guys so much for being here. And I think it's something special to be able to, come together and talk about something that I think most people don't really talk about anymore, which is literature. Talking about books, I think, is something that people always assume is a library concept or something that always has to take place at a bookstore. But I think there's a lot of beauty of just gathering around, grabbing a cup of coffee, and talking about something as special as your novel. And as we set the stage for this interview, I want to first talk about your experience with writing in general. The potential of creating fictional worlds are endless, and I couldn't help but admire the amount of depth you put into your work. Where did you get the idea of creating a story revolving around an epic war between high elves and their enemies that roam in the Shadow Realm?
So, I'll give a little bit more background about me. So I actually have an undergraduate business degree from USC. So you wouldn't normally think that would turn you into a writer. But I had a job downtown and I was taking the train every day, and I've always been a reader. I've always loved reading. I've always loved fantasy in particular, and I was reading too many books. So I had to slow myself down. So I started critiquing books. I had a book blog for a while back in the day when blogs were still like a thing before Substack and all that. And eventually I started writing. And so my very first published novel was The Last Descendant, book one of the Senyari Chronicles, and I had a character. And I had this woman, her name's Rie. She's a human raised by elves in the High Court of Fairy. And I started asking questions. I started asking, well, why is there a human in the elven realms? What are these elven realms? Why are there so many? Why is there war? Why is there she is named a traitor by the High King because she makes contact with the enemy realm. It's basically like crossing the border into North Korea, right? You don't do that. And so why was that her situation? And so I started building this world. Now, that series is complete with 5 books. They're more action, adventure, single point of view stories. But when I got done with that, I realized I had all this world building, all this epic story in my head that I needed to share with readers, that I wanted to test myself to write an epic, something that's longer, something that's multi-point of view, something that is just, there's worldwide stakes where there's political intrigue, there's economics involved. Like, it was a big story and it was very challenging to write. But that's kind of where it came from. So this is actually, Fortune Shadow is the first book in what will be a trilogy. The second book is coming out soon. And it's really the history of this world, but told through the point of view of these elven characters who ultimately become Rie's foster parents and mentors in 3,000 years later, because elves. So yeah, that's where it all came from, and that's where it all started.
No, that is really cool. I've always loved the idea of learning about magical realms, getting into the idea of like elves and medieval fantasy. I'm actually in the middle of watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy right now, and you can't help but when you watch movies like that just wonder, like, how the heck do you create ideas like that? I just finished watching The Two Towers, and in that movie, there's like talking trees. I've seen trees my whole life. Never once have I wondered, oh my God, like, what if they talked back?
What?
No, I'm sorry. I mean,
Come
you know.
on, have you heard about the mushrooms, the fungus, and the trees talk? This is actually a thing.
I mean, I did watch The
They don't
Last
walk,
of
though,
Us,
to be fair.
and I've seen the evil side of what happens when mushrooms get out of hand. But, you know, just the idea of looking at the world around you and looking at things that people don't really think twice about, but for someone to just stare at something and say, you know, I'm going to make this into something magical. You know, that's a skill set, and that takes a lot of creativity and a lot of confidence to believe that, hey, someone's actually willing to also hear you out on, hey, these trees are going to talk. And I think it's really great how in pop culture we see this happening over and over again, of people constantly trying to kind of push the norms of what fantasy looks like, trying to evolve the things that we think are ordinary and turning them into the unordinary. And I think that's really special about your series, especially in this novel Forged in Shadows. You do exactly that. And I couldn't help but get so curious about, you know, your writing style. I went into your acknowledgments, and I saw that in your acknowledgments you shout out a blacksmithing company. You shout out Joyfire Blacksmith, and that made me want to ask, what type of research did you conduct for this story, and what was it like having to craft an epic fantasy after finishing a 5-part series of you talking about the Seniore Chronicles?
Yeah, so as far as research, one of the things that I believe is incredibly important in fantasy, because we are dealing with unbelievable things, magic and mystery and wonder. In order for the reader to believe and buy into this fantastic realm, right, you have to have it grounded in some level of actual human experience. So with regard to the blacksmith, yeah, I've never made a sword, right? And this is important in the story. It's a key piece of the story, is that they're forging this sword. So I had to find someone who knew what they were talking about. So I did. I researched. I just Googled online to find someone who knew, was a local blacksmith. And she's actually based. Well, I met her originally in Dana Point. There was the Tall Ships Festival in Dana Point, and they had sort of like this old town, historical reenactment kind of vibe, like little craftspeople center area, and they had a tent there for these people who do classical blacksmithing, classical iron forging and making metal stuff. And so I asked them if there was someone I could talk to, and I found her. So yeah, so that's where it started from. Like I said, I feel like you need to have that level of reality in order to get people to suspend their disbelief. So whenever there's a question like that, something that either I haven't experienced myself directly, I try to find someone who has. Another key person was my dad. He was in the Navy, so he helped with a lot of the military movements and kind of helping come up with ways to make the military seem more realistic as the realms go to war and so forth. So that's been important to me, to make sure there's that element of foundational grounding that you can buy into.
No, and I think that's super important, because the whole aspect of immersion that comes into these world building scenarios where you want to create something magical and want to make it believable for someone that really wants to dive deep into what this lore looks like. I think that type of research is important. And I think it's even cooler to know that people still make swords. I thought that was out of date. I think I've seen more swords in video games than I've seen them in museums and stuff. And to know that there are still blacksmithing stations out there, that's cool.
And so you can actually go on Instagram. I'm trying to remember. There's I can't remember the guy's name right now, but there are people on Instagram or TikTok who are forging swords, and in fact they're making these swords from video games and from fantasy novels, and they're like conceptual things that probably didn't really exist in medieval times. Like, I don't think people used swords that were 3 times their height, and you can't swing that around, right? But yeah, they're doing this, and it's still out there. It just proves to me that craft matters, no matter what that craft is, and there's still an audience for it, and there's still people out there looking for craftsmanship.
No, absolutely. I'm definitely going to have a meeting with Elias after to see if the budget can hold us getting a sword, because a book-based sword would actually help a lot with marketing, in my opinion. But no, thank you for saying that. And I think it's cool that when you decide to go through something such as creating an epic fantasy, you have to put in the work. You also have to like do the lore building. And I think it's interesting how when you were writing your main series, which is the Seniori Chronicles, you already had all this lore behind, in your head to kind of help you create this story. But what kind of gave you that decision for you to say, hey, this lore is great enough for me to want to create a whole different series off of it? Because I feel like sometimes you can think of something and be like, oh, this makes sense for this character. But there's also examples of some worlds, like for example, I think of Star Wars. Star Wars doesn't do a lot of context sometimes. When you're watching the first 3 movies, you meet all these different heroes and they don't really share their backstory. The backstory is assumed, they're in their moment and they're already like, great, and they're just trying to fight their wars. What made you want to take that step of saying, hey, you know what, instead of just having it be a personal lore set for me, just to help me create my characters and flesh them out more, I'm going to go ahead and write about it, develop it more, and then share it with my audience?
It's all about the characters. So I knew after writing the Seniori Chronicles, she, like I said, she has these foster parents who are elves, and I had these characters and I wanted to tell their story. And of course, I already had the world building, and I knew it wasn't something after Rie that I wanted to tell. It was actually how these 2 characters came together, how they ultimately shaped the world around them. And that's why the tagline is, not all heroes shine, some must rise from the shadows or how do I phrase it now? Some must rise from the shadows to claim the light. There it is on the back of the book. Because I do believe that the small individual, the person who's the seamstress, or the person who's the kind of failure son of the greatest blacksmith, right? These are 2 individuals who start out kind of from nothing and ultimately shape the world around them. And so that's where it came from. I had these characters, I wanted to tell their story, and through them, I can share more of the world that Rie ultimately inhabits.
Thank you for answering that, and I think that's also a great point. I think characters are extremely important. When you're writing any story, I think if you want to make the story believable, you make the characters believable as well. And how do you do that? It's by making perfection, by having them be imperfect. And that actually creates that human element where you kind of understand that, wait a minute, they're not perfect beings that just walk around and solve every problem right off the bat. These are people that have flaws. These are people that have emotions, some of them negative, some of them positive, and it kind of helps people understand, like, okay, I may not know what it's like to be the failure of a blacksmithing, like a famous blacksmith that, hey, I don't know what to do. I can't make a sword as well as other people, but I know what it's like to, maybe feel disappointment from someone that you care about, or to feel that sense of guilt where it's like, I know somebody wants me to do something, but it's not really a path that's really destined for me. I want to see what else is out there in the world. These are real, topics that I feel like everybody at some point has to address in their lives. And it's cool that, in a magical book, you learn about real life situations, you learn about real life concepts. And I wanted to ask, like, for the timeline of this, did you finish the Seniori Chronicles first and then you decided to write these books? Or was it something that you were writing the series for Seniori Chronicles and then you just got really excited one day and you're like, okay, let me just start a draft for Forged in Shadows. And then over time, like, you kind of just bounced between the 2? Because I could totally see that happening where, you're writing a character in Seniori Chronicles, you're developing this person, and then you go, I'm gonna make note of that, and you put that in the corner, and then you develop that a little bit, and then you go back to Seniori Chronicles. Like, what is it like tethering between like gigantic pieces of lore?
So I did finish the Seniori Chronicles first, and then I started Forged in Shadow. But I will say that when I write, as I'm developing the world building, as I'm developing the characters, I do take notes, right? So I had a lot of backstory. I had a lot of existing events and plot points that I knew had to happen in these stories, but I hadn't actually started the writing. Interestingly though, now, I actually have another series that's a contemporary fantasy series, completely unrelated to the epic fantasy, because the epic fantasy is creatively very heavy. It's truly epic, and it's all in my brain, and it's like trying to eat a huge, Christmas dinner. You can't always eat the huge Christmas dinner. Sometimes you just need a snack. And so the contemporary fantasy is kind of my literary creative snack. And so there are 2 books in that series so far. I'm about to start the 3rd one now that the 2nd book in the epic fantasy is coming out. And so I am now kind of bouncing back and forth between those 2 because I need that sort of brain rest. I need to be able to change ideas and change perspectives and kind of be creatively a little bit more flexible. So I will say that I do bounce back and forth to kind of give myself that refresh and be able to do something a little different. But originally, no, the Seniori Chronicles was done first.
No, thank you for answering that. And I also want to ask really quick, like, what is it like organizing notes like that? Because I feel like if you're writing a 5-book
organization,
series,
what? No, I mean, so I have notebooks. I mean, honestly, and they're just, if I think anybody other than myself tried to actually read them, like they'd see words they recognized, they'd see characters they recognize, but my ideas change and shift so much, and then I'm like, okay, no, wait, what did I think back then? And then, no, I don't like that anymore, so now I'm gonna do something different. So they end up just being this like gobbledygook mess of stuff. It's my brain vomit. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's awesome because I think there are moments where people see like epic fantasies and they sometimes wonder like, how does someone go about creating that? And I feel like sometimes the answer is just, yeah, I just thought about it. And you're like, well, what? Like that's so, it's so hard to, to kind of think about it. But, I think that's great how you have notebooks because that kind of shows the amount of work that you put in. You've talked about the research that you put in by talking to people to help you fill in the blanks on, what type of experience leads to writing a story about a character that has a specific pathway. But also your own experience of you being a creative. You have your own set of research, your own notebooks of like, this character is going to do this at some point. I don't know where, or when, but I'm going to do this and I'm going to see how I can wrap it in. And I think that's a really great practice in general for people that want to try any form of art or any type of, just anything that has to do with their passions, where it never hurts to take those notes, never hurts to have something handy to kind of just write down something like, hey, I really care about this. I'm just going to jot it down and I'm going to go ahead and like go back to it later. I mean, therapy, they always talk about journaling. That's such a huge thing for people to just write out your thoughts.
So if there are any, aspiring authors, writers out there, one of the key things that I have found incredibly helpful is journaling for the story, or specifically for a scene. So like if you're gonna sit down to write, you have this scene to write, but you're just struggling to get started. Sometimes the best thing I can do is literally I close my eyes and I'm sitting at the keyboard and I guess I've gotten good enough that I can type without looking. But so that's step one. But so you sit there and you type and you go, okay, it's cold outside, the wind's blowing, my character, she's feeling sad because someone just died and now she's gotta fight her way through this nightmare despite the fact that she's grieving and no grammar, no punctuation, just what is she feeling? What is the temperature of the air? What is she smelling? All that sensory detail. And you journal that for 2, 3, 5 minutes, whatever you feel comfortable with. And then all of a sudden you're in the scene and you can write that scene. So the journaling is incredibly helpful for building that creativity and not judging yourself. All too often, we edit ourselves before we've even written a word, and that's not helpful, right? So sit down, just go, let it flow, and then you can actually start writing the scene.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely going to have to do that because I think I have some bunch of random ideas, and sometimes I have a problem where I'll write something, I'll go back to it, I'm like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever written. What does this mean? Like, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm like, oh, I have an idea. Like, it's about this vampire that decides to, like, fly, and then his wings get cut off, and he falls down. He meets elves, and then they have like a picnic. And like, I'm waking up the next morning, I'm like, I gotta stop writing. Like, I need to stop doing this. And I think it's great that you have that form of freedom to be able to jot notes, but also have that mental bookmark to say, I'm gonna go back to this and wrap it back in, to weave these storylines together, and making sure that these details really pop out when you are trying to flesh out the story of what this initial idea was trying to represent. And I also just wanted to ask, like, what do you prefer writing? Because I feel like you've touched different genres of that fiction realm, where there's contemporary romance, there's action adventure fiction with the Seniority Chronicles, and then you have this epic fantasy, which is like that Christmas dinner. You're coming out of it like you're just like tired, you're like fatigued, you're like, wait a minute, like I just read about a war. What do you prefer writing, and what are the pros and cons in your head about like, what do you like kind of working on?
Well, the reason I have 3 very different series is because I like writing it all. Actually, if you were to truly be a writing pro and doing everything you can to make great sales, ideally you write 1 series or maybe 2, but they're related and they're all the same genre and you hit the same tropes and you're providing that same experience for your reader because your reader loves that, your reader loves that, and you can just keep putting that stuff out and it's great and it does really well for sales. I don't do that. I really struggle with that. Sometimes I joke I have career ADHD, undiagnosed, obviously, because I do have that sort of personal need to jump around and try and do different things. I've also written nonfiction for writers. I used to coach writers. There's a lot of different things that I've done, and I really enjoy doing live events. And so I'm not just sitting at my computer writing a book for 8 hours a day. Like, there are authors that can do that, and I'm just amazed. They put up 6,000 words a day, and I'm like, I can do 500 today. And that's just different work processes. But so for me, all the genres, subgenres of fantasy, I could also do sci-fi. I have thought about doing sci-fi, but speculative fiction, all the subgenres, I love them all. I really enjoy writing them all. But to the pros and cons, the epic fantasy for me, like I said, it's very heavy. Doing my contemporary fantasy, which is a bartender, and it was originally supposed to be cozy fantasy, but it's really not. It's actually kind of psychologically dark, but it's still light for me, I guess. And so that's a little bit faster paced. Like, I get to weave in a little bit more snark, and I have a bartender friend who helps me make drinks for those books, right? It's a very different creative process. The Seniority Chronicles was obviously my debut series, so I was learning how to write with a lot of that. But always they're all different, but they're all, they appeal, they scratch different itches on my creative brain.
What are some of the lessons that you've learned after writing the Seniority Chronicles that you put into Forged in Shadows? Because I'm sure after writing 5 books, there's so much you've gained from when you first started to the end of your debut series. Was there something that you mentally took note of that you were just telling yourself, like, okay, like, this is something I really enjoy, make sure you implement this, like, kind of like, this is like Megan's flavor that I want to add into into the story. What were some things that you just mentally took note of that you remember through your first journey that helped you kind of start your second and like later on your other series as well?
So from a process standpoint, a lot of it is simply consistency. It's getting your butt in the chair, making sure I have to write first thing in the day, because if I start doing marketing or if I start doing social media or if I start doing, the business aspects of things, the production, I will completely forget about the actual writing. So when I'm actively working on a book, drafting, I have to do it first thing in the morning. I have to set my minimums. My minimum is 500 words a day. Sometimes I do a lot more than that, but at least 500 words a day, 5 days a week. I don't work on the weekends except for events, but I don't write. Because life, and I've got kids, and so that was kind of a process thing for me that was very important. I had to be consistent, and I had to get myself going. After Forged in Shadow, I realized I need to do a better job outlining. I've never been a great outliner. I've never been someone who puts the whole plot down first. I like to follow the characters and say, when I'm writing a character, I try to sit inside that character as I'm writing. So I'm following their decisions. And so with the Seniority Chronicles, that actually worked really well because it's a single point of view story. But with Forged in Shadow, all of a sudden I was doing multi-point of view, and I had these interweaving, storylines, and they had to meet up in certain places. And oh, by the way, some of the plot points in the epic are mentioned in the Seniority Chronicles, so I had to make sure that those lined up correctly and occurred the way I described them in the Seniority Chronicles. So it got a lot more complicated, a lot faster. So I need to do a better job of outlining.
No, I mean, I appreciate the honesty because I've also tried to dabble with writing, and I think I'm the opposite. I love outlining because it's so easy to say, this war starts, this character lives, this character dies, boom, pretty. Like, it looks so nice. And then to flesh out the details, you're like, do I have to? Like, it's a lot of work because then you start getting into the intricacies of what is it like to be in a character in that situation? What are their emotional states? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What do they say? Are they the type to run right into a scene and they just have to like improv it, or are they the type to be a little bit more smart behind the scenes? They plan things out and they go into it. And I really appreciate how you're honest about your writing process because I think everyone at some point has touched some form of fantasy. And I think it's really nice to know that it's so inclusive to where you don't need to have a lot of experience, you don't need to have a lot of, you don't need to have a full developed skill set of, I'm a master author, I can now touch fantasy. It's fun. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be a little bit lighthearted when you're writing it. And it's okay to have those, those notes where it's like, okay, like next time be a little bit better at the outlining, but hey, I really did a good job on this one. Look at this character, I did a good job here. And like I said, I dabbled in writing and I work at a middle school. And students will come up to me and they'll see this outline that I'm writing or my chapter that I'm working on. And they're like, oh, Mr. Nathan, is that an essay for school? I'm like, no, like I'm doing this for fun. And they're like, you write for fun? And I'm like, yeah, like how do you think Lord of the Rings were written? How do you think Harry Potter was written? Like all these stories that, growing up, they used to be pop culture. And now they're like, yeah, I want to play Fortnite. I'm like, no, like go back into writing, like go back into trying to like explore different like forms of fantasy and stuff. And you would be surprised how some of the students, you can see that light kind of shine in their eyes when they see something and they're like, what is it? And you explain the story to them and they go, oh, that's really cool. Like, I want to try that. Mm-hmm. And, I think in schools, like the school that I'm at, there is a little bit of a D&D/creative writing club. And it's really cool seeing that form of fantasy building emerge in them at such a young age. And so I think it's really cool that, interviews like this kind of maybe introduce fantasy writing to people that might want to try it, introduces that idea that, hey, if you want to take that step, you just need to take the step. Like, it doesn't have to be the biggest step, it's just a matter of trying.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's just writing in general, to be honest. I mean, literary fiction, okay, normally you're going to probably go get a MFA. But any kind of speculative fiction, whether it's, thriller, mystery, the genre fiction, if you're writing fantasy, sci-fi, whatever, horror, whatever you enjoy, writing is about practice and it's about craft. So getting those words on the page right away, like just putting things down. You can always, the great thing that I always have to remember too, and that I remind people of, is you can always delete stuff, right? You can always get rid of it if you don't like it later. Or you can change a detail. Or, I mean, like, my editing process, especially with Quenched in Secrets, which is the next one coming out, I changed dramatically. Like, I edited a lot out of that book. Keeping the language clean. But yeah, I mean, and so getting it on the page first, you can always edit, but you can't edit a blank page. So I think that's really important. And then reminding yourself that any kind of art, it doesn't matter what it is, any kind of art takes practice, right? Like, people expect with music, right? You start taking lessons maybe when you're very young in elementary school, and it takes years and years and years to become a master. Well, guess what? That's true of writing as well. You can't, everybody thinks, oh, well, you can just write a novel. And it's like, you can, and you can finish it, but it might not be great yet, right? Like, I had several starts to novels. I had one completed one, and it was not good. So I never published it. No one will ever see it. It was a werewolf story. It was very derivative of many other things, and it was not good. So I didn't publish it, but that's okay. I needed that story. I needed to know I could finish a novel. I needed to know I had the ideas. I needed to know that marathon of writing a book is possible. So just do it, and then edit it, and then decide, and if you like that story enough, and even if it's not good, you can edit it and edit it and edit it and edit it until you get it done. Or you can start on something new, which is what I did. So a lot of it really does just come down to getting your butt in the chair, getting words on the page or in your computer and then going for it.
Right. No, I love that advice. I'm definitely going to start writing when I get back home. I'm definitely going to try to do the 500 words a day. That sounds really,
Start with
doable.
50.
50?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
It's the, what is it, Atomic Habits thing? I think it's Atomic Habits. They talk about start with the absolute minimum thing that's impossible not to get done.
Right.
Right? 50 words. Anybody can write 50 words. That's like 2 sentences, right? So just start there. And then, oh, now I can do 100. Now I can do 200. Now I can do 500. All right, that's my minimum. And then you can do more. You can always do more.
No, that's great. There's also something else about fantasy writing that I wanted to ask you about, because there's a quote in your book that I really thought was interesting. You wrote, "Elves were reserved. They weren't supposed to show emotion, or so he'd been taught. It was intended to remain in secret, internal, under the surface. Otherwise, it could be used against you." And the reason I thought this quote was interesting because you're in, you're in this world of fantasy, and that quote just felt so real. And it reminded me that even though, and we talked about this before, even though you're reading something that's completely fantastical and fictional, there's always a constant bridge that exists where, even the magical creatures that you meet and the people that you talk to in this novel or you watch talk, they carry human flaws. And I wanted to ask, what do you think are some of the advantages of using magical fantasy to talk about real life concepts like human behavior and identity?
Oh, now you're going to get me going. I think fantasy is a fabulous gateway to deal with real world issues. It gives you the distance you need to take a step back because it doesn't feel personal anymore. It feels magical. It feels like, these are characters. And yes, they're experiencing things, but you're developing that empathy with them and you're kind of thinking about things from different perspectives. Well done fantasy where you can empathize with the villain, where you can see from their point of view maybe that, they don't think that they're the villain. They think they're the hero of their own story. So why is that? What turned them into the villain? What decision did they make that crossed the line? So you can start to see how these interactions play out. And I do think that fantasy can be a really great way to deal with those real world issues. There's political intrigue. There's a megalomaniacal king, and a narcissistic princess in these books. And so, we've seen that in real life. And how does that interact with other characters? How do you deal with that? It's a really, really, really good way of getting people to think about things without making them feel attacked, right? So I think empathy is developed through fiction and a lot of the thought processes and how you can decide what you think is right or wrong. What are your values? What are your priorities? Where are you in the world, even though it's not a real world?
Yeah, I think there's something special about, if it's real life, you feel attacked, but the second you put an elf in there, all of a sudden, hey, we can talk about it.
Yeah. But,
and I think, those themes are important. And I think it's something really, I think that's the power of fantasy, because there's so many other genres out there in the world that you can read for literature, and they all essentially do the same thing. Sometimes, the horror genre really explores the idea of fear and what it means to really, address something that you're uncomfortable with. Crime fiction is all about addressing, social norms and how we perceive what is a crime and what is seen as, anything other than that. With fantasy, I feel like it's really unique because you can make it an epic fantasy where you address things like warfare, politics, economics, and identity. And it's kind of like training wheels for understanding who you are even. And it's like a little bit of like a small mirror where, if you don't have to really address it right then and there, read the book and enjoy it. And then after, you might realize wait a minute, I think like this character. What did this character do? Oh, well, this character kind of worked towards fighting their fears, even though it was uncomfortable. Maybe there was a section of the book where they even didn't like how they addressed the situation, but they still went for it. And I really enjoy how in this book, the special thing about Forged in Shadows is that the main characters of this novel, they aren't seen as main characters. At first when I was reading the novel, like we talked about earlier, what you were saying, the first character that you're introduced to is the son of a very famous blacksmith, and he's anything but. This son is, seen as a failure or just a reckless anomaly in this forge. I thought you were just building context. I didn't know this was the main character or one of them. So then when I got to half the book, I'm like, wait a minute, he's still coming. I'm like, okay, this dude, I think he's a main character. And there's another character that you were talking about, that's the seamstress. Nobody talks about the seamstress or somebody that makes clothing in these stories. It's always the princess or the prince, the kings, or someone that's just naturally heroic. This story it's a hero story. It's a story about heroes that starts with everyday people that become heroes. And I think that's what I really enjoy about this book. And I think it's such a huge pro of reading this series is that you learn how everyday people become special. And I really love that too because there's a character in here called Guillermin Senyaro. He has the ability to foresee the future, and sometimes he sees a dark image of what's to come. He sees this war coming, he sees all this tension building, and he knows that he has the ability to make more choices to affect this outcome. He's overpowered. If he really wanted to, he can fix everything in a blink of an eye. But he decides to pull back to allow these characters to make their choices instead. What was it like making a story where you had an overpowered character have to pull back and giving room to these ordinary characters to become the heroes that you want them to be by the end of the series?
So I actually deal with that very directly in Quenched in Secrets, because although yes, he is overpowered and he can see the future, the thing is that he sees multiple futures all at once. So he has to kind of navigate what is the best outcome or what is the outcome he can live with. And he's not always able to stop something from happening. Sometimes it has to happen in order for something better to come out the other side. So I don't want to, no spoilers, right? No spoilers. But something very bad happens in Forged in Shadow, and one of the characters gets very, very angry at Garamond because he's like, why didn't you stop it? You could have just told me, and we could have stopped it. This wouldn't have happened. And he's like, but I couldn't, because if I had, then all these other futures would have closed off. It had to happen, and yeah, it was horrible and it was traumatic and it was cataclysmic, but it had to happen. Otherwise, other worse things would have happened. So sometimes you have to choose the less bad option, and so he has to deal with that a lot. But to your point, he is kind of the mentor character. He's actually the mentor character in both series, also the Senyari Chronicles, and he knows a lot, and he's so much fun to write. He's so much fun to write because you just get to like play with all the what ifs. You know, what would happen if he changed this, or if he said this, or what else, you know. And so you can always kind of navigate things differently depending.
Right. No, and I think that's also a great lesson, right? The idea that sometimes in life, yes, like the lesser evil can sometimes create good outcomes, and sometimes moments of despair or like sadness, anguish can create other moments of happiness in the future. And I really like how this character really talks about this concept of the silver lining, where it's like even though there's something bad happening and there's still a lot of problems in the world, it doesn't mean that you can't believe that there's going to be a brighter future, even if you don't see it sometimes. And I think that's the great lesson that I really loved that this character teaches to the other characters, is the idea of patience. That sometimes the immediate outcome isn't what's important, it's playing the long game. And I think that's a metaphor for life. You know, sometimes people just want something to happen right away because they feel like it's the necessary good that needs to happen right now. But if you just wait a little bit longer, that's when you start seeing other options open up, other pathways open up, and you might realize that maybe that moment of hesitancy could create a moment of redemption, or even a moment of like understanding, like, wait a minute, like, maybe I shouldn't have been that harsh. Maybe it was better to take a step back and adjust things differently. And I think that just talks about fantasy in general again. Like, it just talks about really real life ideas that you can just understand and be like, wow, like, how can I implement this into my life? I mean, it definitely made me think about the choices that I make in life, because if I had the ability to see the future, I don't know if I would have the power to step back if I could see the bigger outcome. I feel like I would still feel that need to be selfish and maybe do something that's immediate. And I think it's cool how you have a character that already has that boundary set, and that's why the other characters don't understand him. They're like, I don't know how you're able to do this. And I think that's cool. And I know you talked about how this story is more developed in Quenched in Secrets, and I did want to ask you, without diving into too many details of the story itself, Can you speak about what it was like writing that novel compared to Forged in Shadows? Like, I know you talked about the outlining, but were there any other moments where you recognized like either your writing style changing or even your characters taking a path away from what you initially expected?
So, Forged in Shadow, I actually wrote prior to COVID, and I published it in 2020. So it came out right as the world was shutting down. So it took me a long time to actually, and I had actually started writing Quenched in Secrets as Forged in Shadow launched. And because of the state of the world, because of my own mental health, because of so many other issues that we were all dealing with at the time, I kind of had to put Quenched on pause. And that was actually when I wrote my contemporary fantasy, because I needed a drink, so I wrote myself a bartender. So I took a pause on it, and now coming back, so I came back to Quenched around this time actually last year to finish it and to go back and do the editing and to go back and fix the story, because it had gotten darker perhaps than I wanted. I always write a little bit dark. There are some dark elements. There's some psychology in there that you have to question, the gray characters, right? But it was more than I wanted, and it was a little bit chaotic. It was messy. It was a little bit of a dumpster fire, just a little mini one. And so I had to fix it. So it took me a year really to fix it. And I did notice that there were some thought changes, some stylistic changes in my way of writing had also changed because of the contemporary fantasy as well, which again is single point of view, a little bit faster paced and more modern setting, right? I mean, it's modern day. The style of how I wrote was different. So I had to sort of get back into the same mindset that I had from Forged. So I actually reread Forged. Which is very interesting, rereading your own work. I'm just going to say that, because you see things that you're going, oh yeah, I was experiencing that at the time. Oh yeah, okay. It reminds you of like where you were. But yeah, so I had to kind of get back in that mindset and that tone, that epic, a little bit more poetic language, a little bit more detailed prose, a little bit more detailed world building versus the contemporary fantasy. So you do find, that as you write different books, it affects your overall style. So yeah, there was definitely some of that I noticed there was a change. As far as the characters themselves, they more or less, because this story is backstory to the Senyari Chronicles, I already know a lot of the major plot points. Like, I already know certain things have to happen, and they have to happen in a certain order. So those characters kind of had to follow those paths. But I will say that some of their internal monologues and their thought processes as they were going through the storylines and what I felt was actually important to put in the book itself and in the writing versus what is left unsaid, that did change a bit as I went through the process of especially editing Quenched.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that. And as we approach our last question, if I were to want to acquire a copy of Quenched in Shadows, where would I go to get access to your literature?
Well, so I do sell everything direct. I have a website, meganhaskell.com. That is where you can buy signed paperbacks. I actually have special edition hardcovers coming out of Forged in Shadow and Quenched in Secrets. Those are all available for pre-order on my website right now, today. And then the ebooks are everywhere ebooks are sold, so Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, et cetera, so you can get them there as well. And I will also say that Forged in Shadow, I believe, definitely on my website, I think still on, and definitely still on Amazon, I think still on Barnes & Noble, is 99 cents on the ebook right now. So you can get the ebook on wherever you like to buy your ebooks.
Got it. And just in case if you don't remember that, please check out her Facebook and Instagram at Megan Haskell Author. But with all that being said, everybody, that wraps our second in-person live interview with BookBase with author Megan Haskell. Thank you guys so much for being here. We will now move on to the Q&A.
All right. I saw your hand first.
So you talk a lot, you're writing an epic fantasy book. You're making a lot of different, fantasy cultures, races, different types of elves, humans. How do you go about writing that in your process to make sure they all feel distinct enough? Like, do you look at certain things like history or other works in a similar genre?
Yes. No, so I do like to they're called analog cultures, right? So, for example, my fire sheet culture is vaguely based on a little bit Maori or, Polynesian culture. It's a little bit sort of Norse in that they're, some of the things that they wield. There are some similarities to actual cultures that actually do exist. Now, I don't call them out, except for here in an interview, I guess, because obviously I'm not trying to be exact. I'm not trying to mimic those cultures exactly, but I take pieces of things. The city is a little bit like New Orleans with the vines draping over the balconies and stuff like that. So I take inspiration from different cities, different cultures that actually exist on Earth. For a lot of that. And then I do also, like, the elves are very much Tolkien-esque elves in that they have long hair and braids and pointed ears, right? Like the things that you see from the Lord of the Rings movies and everything. There are certain elements that you have to, as a writer, stay true to or touch on for the audience. They want something that's familiar but different. And I know that sounds, it's oxymoronic, but they need something that feels like something that they already know, but with a twist to keep them interested and engaged. And so I've tried to do that with all of the different species, with all of the different, realms and cultures and things. And then, making sure that each of them are unique and distinct comes down to making sure that, like I said, my fire sheet are loosely based on Maori. I have another realm that I actually used, so that the high court. It's the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. I have Louis XIV, right? He had the Hall of Mirrors, and you can Google this. I really was inspired by that imagery of the mirrors and the gold. Everything's gold and everything's ornate, and I wanted that kind of same feel. So the whole city is shining and glittering, and that's why the high elves are the glittering throng, right? So you kind of make these comparisons without making comparisons, but just making sure that each of them are different so that you always know where you are in the story. So I saw your hand.
You kind of answered it, but
Okay.
I'll still ask it anyways. Basically, I just wanted to ask what other art forms, like movies, television, art pieces, plays, things like that, theater, what inspires you to write every day currently and in your past works?
So I do think that as a creative person of any kind, you need to constantly be filling that creative well. So I watch a lot of movies. I watch TV. I used to watch a lot of movies. I used to watch a lot of TV. Now I don't have as much time anymore, but that's beside the point. I do what I can, right? And Googling things and doing the research and saying, hey, I want something that's gold. I'm going to Google, golden halls, and then finding, the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. I was like, you kind of follow those paths, and you're constantly trying to feed that brain. I watch a lot of YouTube, just random, I don't do so much like the dancing stuff, but like random documentaries. There's some great mythology, YouTube channels that I follow that I get inspired for the different, mythological elements of the stories. But I think just constantly looking and making the connections between different things. That's what being creative is.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about like how you feel and your creative process. How does it feel writing a prequel? Is it a little bit easier because you have something to refer to in the future, or does that make it a little bit harder because sometimes maybe when you wrote the first book, you could kind of do whatever you want, you could craft this wherever you want, and you can kind of do that for the prequel too, but it still has to follow some sort of flow. Does that feel a little restrictive, or do you feel like you can make it work and it just goes and it flows nicely into the next thing?
It's easier and it's harder.
Yeah.
It's both things. Having the certain plot points that I know have to happen at least gives me the next destination on the story. Knowing certain things that the characters have to do makes it, well, they have to do that, so I have to write that. But that's also a constraint that means that I can't do what I've always done with the Scenario Chronicles and with the contemporary fantasy, with like the sitting in the character. I can't just follow the character in these books because I have to hit those certain things. So it's finding the balance between the two, being able to let the characters tell their story and move through the world in the way that they want to do it, but knowing that ultimately they have to get to that destination. It's easier and it's harder. I don't know.
Following up on what you just said about being in the character as you write it, how do you sort of control for your attitude that day, influencing the character's attitude that day? And do you try to adjust that, say, when you edit, or do you see, well, I'm in the character, so my emotions that day don't come through?
That is a really good question. That is a really good question. I would say, I think it's a little bit of everything, right? So I definitely, when I'm in the character, it's like watching a movie in my head, right? I'm experiencing it through their eyes. So my emotions that day don't necessarily affect the outcome of the writing itself, but it does affect how motivated I am to write in the first place, right? So like if I'm exhausted and I'm just having a rough day, sometimes I really don't want to sit at my computer. And in those cases, I'll go for a walk, or I'll do something, meditate, or do something to try and get my head back in the game. But once I'm in that chair, once I'm in the character, I don't know that it affects the words on the page all that much. But I will say also, there have been times when, I'll be editing after the fact, and I'll be like, no, this character would not do that. I don't know what I was thinking. But I think that's just more of the editing process. I'm not sure that that's the day I was writing so much. It's just like, it wasn't my emotions that day or my experience that day. It was just, I went down a path that ultimately I didn't like for that character, and that character, like, you can feel when things are off with a character. And I've also found that sometimes when I have a little bit of a block and I'm finding it hard to write, a lot of times it is because that character has gone off it doesn't make sense for their motivation. It doesn't make sense for who they are as a person, their background, their personality, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes you have to bring it back. But yeah, I don't know that my, once I'm in the writing, I don't know that my emotions affect it too much. It's a good question.
I feel like a lot of us are introduced to fantasy at a young age, but for you to be introduced to fantasy and want to be a part of it and creating it, how old were you and what did it that made that tick? Because there's so many people that love fantasy, but you took it a step further in saying, I'm going to create fantasy. So how old were you and what did that for you?
I never thought I was going to be a writer until I was an adult. And like I said, I was already riding the train, going to work every day, and that was my creative outlet because I was a number crunching accounting job. And I've always had both sides of my personality. I like the business, I like the numbers, I like spreadsheets, but I also like, story, and I like art, and I played piano my whole life, that kind of thing. So I've always had both sides. So I was first introduced to fantasy with The Hobbit by my dad when I was, I think, in 5th grade, thereabouts. And then once I kind of got hooked, that was essentially all I read for fun. Sci-fi, fantasy, both, but Ender's Game and Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern, and The Green Rider, and then Laurel K. Hamilton, the Anita Blake early series, the Necromancer piece, not the later stuff for reasons. But I continue, Alona Andrews, all these, Anne Rice, right? All these authors, I just loved being able to escape into these other worlds and see these heroes and how they made decisions and how they, stuck to their values or stuck to their priorities or face down, odds that seemed insurmountable. That was always very, very appealing to me. And so when I decided I wanted to start writing, I did start with other things first. I had an organic gardening blog. Not anymore. I had the book blog where I reviewed books, and I would do like full critiques. I had like sections on the characters and sections on the setting and the plot, and did I feel like it was, what did I like about the story, what did I not like about the story. It was like a full-on like critique. I had a format and a template and this whole thing, which was very good study for how to write, I think. But I didn't actually start writing fantasy until I was, 23, 24. And once I decided to start creative writing fiction, that was it was just natural. It was just the thing that I'd always loved to read, and I just wanted to be part of that. And I do get the question also a lot if, are these books intended for children? Because a lot of, I think, adults think fantasy is for kids. And it certainly can be, and I think there are some fantastic YA books out there. My books are not intended for a YA audience. They're probably PG-13. There's some graphic violence and some gore, but there's not anything else to be worried about from a YA perspective. But fantasy can be for adults, and I think as pop culture has changed, we're starting to see more of that, where adults are just as happy to admit that they read fantasy as they are to read the Oprah book pick of the week or whatever.
So I know everyone's been asking questions about kind of like what inspires that fantasy, like that unlocking that fantasy part of your brain. We actually had the same question. It was funny. So we just want to know kind of like the opposite end, like what's the cap on there? So when it comes to fantasy, for me personally, I'm a very quantitative person. So I know the bounds of physics. Like I know gravity is going to be the same. I know everything's here that we know is going to be the same. How do you balance the creative freedom that you have and just not go too far with anything's possible? Like how do you write your own bounds of the universe, essentially, of the fantasy universe?
So I'm gonna take this to the magic system, right? So first off, all my books, like I said, I try to ground them in reality as much as possible, so that the reader can feel like they have an experience that they can relate to. But when you're talking about magic systems, there's what they call soft magic or hard magic. There's hand-wavium, which is like the Force in Star Wars. Nobody really knows how it works, but you just buy into it, right? It's hand-wavium. And then you have Brandon Sanderson, who writes, you eat a certain mineral and now you have different powers, and it's very strict and very focused, or there's certain sigils that you have to draw, and it's very prescriptive, right? So there's this spectrum. The key thing, I think, is whatever you choose, wherever you are on that spectrum, is to make sure that you stay consistent to that, whatever system you've developed in your head. So the Force in Star Wars, right? They can move stuff around, they can lift up incredibly heavy objects, but they can't, as far as I'm trying to think, I don't think so. They can't make a person do something that they otherwise would not do. Meaning they can't get into their mind and say, you're gonna walk across the space, you're gonna pick this up. They don't do that, right? They can lift the person and move them to the thing, but they can't get in their head necessarily. I think. No, somebody who's more well-versed in Star Wars might correct me, but go with me. So it's kind of the same thing. And then if you have the hard magic system, right, you have to say that, well, if, this sigil means that you can manipulate water, then that sigil can only manipulate water. It can't manipulate fire, right? So sticking with that system, whatever that is the most important thing. It's just being consistent. As soon as you break that consistency, the reader's going to not believe you anymore. They're going to stop suspending their disbelief. But if you can stay consistent with whatever you choose to do, whatever magic you put into the world, then typically the reader will go along with you. Or if not, then your book's probably not for them, and they probably shouldn't be reading fantasy. Hi, I'm Megan Haskell. I write The War of the Nine Fairy Realms. Forged in Shadow is book 1, and you can find it on BookBase.